Back in 1988, the video game market crash was but a memory. The Nintendo Entertainment System entered the fray in North America in 1985 to phenomenal success, and as technology progressed and consumers were wanting more colors, more graphics, more power, the NES's successor was in the works. Sony executive Ken Kutaragi was fascinated with his daughter's love for her Nintendo Famicom system, and proceeded to speak to Nintendo on the sly about working together on their next system, showcasing the Sony SPC700 sound chip, which would actually eventually be used in the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Long story short, Nintendo and Sony entered a pseudo-partnership, with Sony developing their own system known as the PlayStation that had the ability to not only play SNES cartridges, but also games from Sony's own Super Disc format. The Nintendo PlayStation was born, but it didn't last all that long. Nintendo had also secretly been in talks with Philips, who took the spot next to Nintendo in 1991, with Sony being booted from the project. Sony's hopeful venture into video games didn't stop there, however, and after brief talks with Sega, who shot down the opportunity to collaborate, Sony went about it alone. 1994 saw the release of the original PlayStation, and the rest, as they say, is history. In an attempt to not suffer the same fate as the 3DO and Atari Jaguar, Sony took to forming as many strong relationships with existing studios as possible to produce third-party titles for the PlayStation, and the likes of Mortal Kombat 3 from Midway ended up on the console. It didn't mean Sony weren't going to put internal effort into the system though, as Poly's Entertainment, led by Kazunori Yamauchi, was formed within Sony Computer Entertainment. As a means to bring a Mario Kart-esque title to the system, Poly's developed Mototoon Grand Prix, which is honestly all I need to say on the matter. The title itself does enough to explain what the game is. Released in 1994, while the concept was indeed silly, the execution was nothing short of marvelous. The game was well refined, the graphics were stunning, and most importantly, it was fun. Its success led to a sequel, thoughtfully titled Mototoon Grand Prix 2 in 1996, but Poly's Entertainment's first flagship project actually began life back in 1992, as Yamauchi took a few people aside to begin planning an incredibly ambitious title. Once Mototoon Grand Prix 2 had released, it was all hands on deck for completing Test Drive, but as it was eventually known, Gran Turismo. Five years of development for a video game back in the 90s was quite simply unheard of. Board rejection after board rejection kept Yamauchi & Co. on the Mototoon games up until the success of its sequel, which finally led to the green light for Gran Turismo. While there were a few years of work on the title prior to it landing center stage development, the small team of only about 10 almost doubled by the time it released. These developers worked long hours, slept under their desks, and were met with seasons they didn't realize had come by once they'd left the office. Stepping outside in just a t-shirt, Yamauchi was once met with a blisteringly cold winter. He had no idea how much time had passed. While we know it today as crunch, which I don't feel I need to explain, I'm sure you know what that is, the difference with Gran Turismo was that it was a title that Poly's Entertainment's employees were very passionate about making. And come late 1997 in Japan, you could really see the time and effort they put in. Gran Turismo set out to be the benchmark for racing sims, not only in the graphics department but also in terms of simulation. Yamauchi was always disappointed as a child going into the arcades and playing racing games that didn't feel all like driving a real car, so that's what he planned to replicate in Gran Turismo. Upwards of 200 cars were in each regional version of the original game, and to think a team of sub-20 people produced it is nothing short of astonishing. Poly's Entertainment's hard work paid off as Gran Turismo released to widespread critical acclaim. The first title to fully utilise the sparkly DualShock controller for the original PlayStation, it ended up being the best-selling game for the system with over 10 million units sold, just beating out the also legendary Final Fantasy VII. Gran Turismo's success meant more leverage at Sony. The team were granted greater autonomy, changed their name to the incumbent Polyphony Digital, and set to work on what was to come next. It doesn't take a genius to know that a sequel to Gran Turismo was going to happen. It was arguably the killer app, or one of the killer apps for the PlayStation 1, and pretty much printed money for Sony and the devs. Hopes were incredibly high for this sequel, and Polyphony didn't cut corners to churn something out. They were honing their skills in realistic vehicle simulation, so the only way they could go was up. The goal for Gran Turismo 2 was to create a better product, which with how successful and polished the first was, it was pretty much a case of just making more Gran Turismo. Boasting a roster of over 600 vehicles, tripling the number from the last game, adding rally cars, and for the first time in the series, real-life tracks Laguna Seca and Pikes Peak joined the selection alongside the usual fictional ones. Visually and mechanically, Gran Turismo 2 and its predecessor were very similar, though the brake mechanics had been reworked somewhat. Otherwise, consumers knew what they were getting their hands on in late 1999, and once again they were completely enthralled by the experience. The development time for the sequel wasn't as vast as that of the first title, and while the first game had a few years of sitting on the sidelines while the Motor2 Grand Prix games were being produced, you'd assume that Gran Turismo 2 got the full spotlight. However, though the team at Polyphony inevitably grew thanks to its success, 1999 saw another title released by the studio, a Mega Boost. A 3D shoot-'em-up with impressive graphics and limit-pushing frame rates on the PS1, and you've probably never heard of it, have you? The marketing for this title was pretty lackluster, so it didn't sell all that well. Gran Turismo 2, however, while not selling as many copies as what came before, still crossed the 9 million unit sales boundary. The slightly quicker development time showed, even if the title landed a 93 on Metacritic. A few bugs were very apparent in the game, such as not being able to properly 100% the game, having cars going missing from the player's garage, and incorrect cars appearing in races. Sony were very open and apologetic about the whole ordeal, so happily exchanged original copies for updated ones. This was before the time of online updates, kids. It smoothed over the hiccup rather well, and Gran Turismo 2 further cemented the franchise into racing title infamy. Come the turn of the millennium, something was brewing over at Sony. Polyphony were masters at pushing hardware to its limits, and those limits were about to be higher than ever before. PlayStation 2 needs no introduction. The best-selling video game system of all time. We say we're going to kill the PC and subsequently birth the Xbox, etc, etc, yeah, you know what the PS2 is. Tentatively titled Gran Turismo 2000, the third game in the franchise was going to push the PlayStation 2 as far as it could go, making development not all that straightforward. As we've seen with the new console release, developers don't get 100% out of a system on launch day, hence why we see better and better graphics and capabilities as we continue through a console's lifespan. Polyphony pushed Gran Turismo 3's graphics as far as they could go with the hardware of the PlayStation 2 they'd mastered, which meant something was going to have to give way for the time needed to make the game as sparkly as possible. The number of cars available in-game was drastically cut down to below 200, as modelling the vehicles with much more clarity was obviously rather time-consuming. Also, Gran Turismo 2000 didn't manage a 2000 release date. Pushed back to mid-2001, you couldn't exactly give it the 2000 suffix, so Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec it was. To really push towards the hardcore crowd, Polyphony collaborated with Logitech to produce an official Gran Turismo force feedback steering wheel, the Logitech GT Force, which was, admittedly, just a recolored Logitech wingman. Nice. Releasing to near critical acclaim like titles before, A-Spec was everything Gran Turismo fans wanted it to be. Though there were fewer cars as mentioned, the immeasurable leap in graphical prowess made up for having less toys on the track, though still, you can't knock 180 odd cars to choose from, including F1 cars for the first time in the franchise. Gran Turismo 3 sold over 14 million copies and to this day is the best-selling title in the franchise. Similar to the first Gran Turismo released on the PlayStation 1, A-Spec would not be alone on the platform. As Polyphony were getting to grips with the PlayStation 2 hardware, the follow-up to Gran Turismo 3, understandably titled Gran Turismo 4, was set to be very ambitious. Ballooning from 180 cars to over 700 was no mean feat, and adding another 20-odd tracks into the mix such as Suzuka, the Nürburgring and Circuit de la Sarthe gave players heaps to sink their teeth into. While it was only capitalised on in a few titles for the system, the PlayStation 2 was capable of online play, provided you had the correct adapters. Gran Turismo 4 was planned to have native online play, but since the game was delayed from its 2003 release, the online aspect was unfortunately removed from the base game. While it was trialled in small numbers in Japan, South Korea and briefly in North America, these tests were held solely for bettering the successor to Gran Turismo 4, not to be added back into the game itself. Another huge step taken by this fourth game was its ability to output at 1080i. Fun fact, the PlayStation 2 was a HD-capable system, but only a measly 4 or 5 games actually supported it. 2 of them you'll hear about today. Once again, the graphics were improved and the physics model got some fantastic additions, including pitching under heavy braking and more realistic loss of momentum when hitting barriers or other cars. Who needs brakes anyway? Also added was a photo mode which does exactly what it says on the tin, but what you didn't expect was the ability to connect an Epson printer to your PS2 and print your pictures. Eat your heart out, Game Boy printer. Upon release in late 2004 or early 2005, depending on where you are, it once again received the usual acclaim the series was known for, but this time there were a few more things that weren't as universally loved. A more realistic damage model was near non-existent, AI drivers felt completely oblivious to the proximity of the player, and the track limit detection was basically absent. These were criticisms from the more hardcore crowd of Gran Turismo 4, which very much felt to be the demographic Polyphony were catering for, as many non-racing sim enthusiasts felt while the gameplay did drop them down the deep end somewhat, the experience was overall enjoyable. Now, before we continue into a new era of Gran Turismo, while not officially part of the franchise, 2006 saw Polyphony Digital step away from their norm similar to their foray into a Mega Boost, but not as drastic. Tourist Trophy, a motorbike racing simulator built on the vast majority of Gran Turismo 4's game engine, released in the first half of 2006, this being the second of the two games that can output at 1080i on the PS2. It was moderately successful, but it would be unreasonable to expect it to be as successful as its sister series. While Tourist Trophy stands alone, Yamauchi, the series creator and CEO of Polyphony, said that a sequel always hangs around in the back of his mind. Anyway, enough about two wheels. Let's get back to 4. The Gran Turismo franchise hasn't all been full-scale flagship releases. Over the course of its lifespan, shorter but hugely successful concept titles launched in between Gran Turismo 3 and 4, acting as pseudo-expansions to the game, featuring the titular concept cars revealed at motor shows. Also released were many preview titles leading up to the mainline games. Gran Turismo 4 and 5 both got prologue titles, there was the aforementioned limited release of an online demo for Gran Turismo 4, and one spin-off that wasn't a full release, but also wasn't just a demo. Sony entered the handheld market with the PSP back in late 2004 in Japan, and it was a dashing bit of kit with great hardware to boot. Polyphony announced their PSP Gran Turismo title at E3 2004, but delay after delay caused it to not release until 2009 alongside the ill-fated PSP Go. A semi-port of Gran Turismo 4, Gran Turismo PSP featured most of the same tracks, a vast roster of over 800 cars, and graphically was very impressive for a handheld game. The PSP was more powerful than its main competition, the Nintendo DS, and it showed. However, the game lacked a career mode. You'd pick a car, track, laps, and go from there. That was about it. There were a few driving challenges, but it almost felt like a hardware demo that was a good 5 years too late. Still, it was a feat to have a game as demanding as Gran Turismo running on a handheld and only taking up about a gig of space. But there was a reason this wasn't called Gran Turismo 5 before Gran Turismo 5. Speaking of Gran Turismo 5... By the second decade of this new millennium, we were well into the 7th generation of games consoles. The Xbox 360 was red-ringing, the Wii was making a killing by making people look like pillocks in their own living rooms, and developers were tearing their hair out attempting to make games for the notoriously difficult PlayStation 3. Polyphony produced a download-only title known as Gran Turismo HD Concept, which was available on disc in Japan soon after the PS3's release. Featuring 1 track and 10 cars, it was a spectacular tech demo of the new system. However, the continuation into the next full title using HD Concept as a baseline was scrapped, and the Gran Turismo 5 prologue replaced it, and Polyphony went from there. Similar to the jump between consoles seen for Gran Turismo 2 and 3, 5 sights were set sky high. The damage model fans have been clamouring for years finally arrived, dynamic weather was introduced, there were major physics improvements, and the number of cars in-game peaked at over 1,000. The PlayStation 3 itself brought about new features too, such as the previously attempted online play, trophies, HD resolutions, and the ability to deliver bug fixes and major updates through the ever-wonderful internet. NASCAR, World Rally Championship, and Super GT licensed content ended up in the game too. The base game gave players a lot to play with in the first place, and the Spec 2.0 update added a plethora of new cars and quality of life tweaks, and opened up a new season of paid DLCs and free updates. Gran Turismo 5 was the seminal PlayStation 3 title. Having kicked off their first foray into the platform in such style, Polyphony solidified themselves as experts with the hardware. As you'd expect from this big list of additions and how the series has fared in the past, Gran Turismo 5 released to critical acclaim. The game felt excellent to play, the graphics were best in class, and the sheer amount of game you got within the asking price was staggering. However, it wasn't squeaky clean in every capacity. The long-awaited damage model may as well have been purely cosmetic, as the amount it appeared to affect the car felt entirely negligible. Furthermore, the oblivious AI still tainted the game, as CPU drivers would break randomly and be entirely unaware of a human player attempting to pass on the inside line. But who needs AI players? Head onto the PlayStation Network and play with others online. Seamless, stable, and a hell of a lot of fun. Also introduced was the Gran Turismo Academy, which ran until 2016, a means of getting into real-life motorsport with Nissan through qualification and competition in Gran Turismo, which, that's just really cool. By the end of the PlayStation 3's lifespan, Gran Turismo 5 had sold just shy of 12 million copies, being the second best-selling game on the PS3, behind... any guesses? Grand Theft Auto 5. Yeah, that was originally a PS3 game and they were about to re-release it on PlayStation 5. Blimey, make another game, Rockstar. The next generation was almost here. The Xbox One had been both unveiled and butchered by Walking Catastrophe Don Matrick, and the PlayStation 4 took the piss and the spotlight come 2013. The PS4 looked to be a fantastic console, nowhere near as bogged down by DRM or being flaunted as some kind of all-in-one entertainment system. Launch titles were looking strong, and the usual expectation of Gran Turismo being the benchmark was present. However, Gran Turismo 6 wasn't coming to the PlayStation 4, instead it was coming to the PlayStation 3. Featuring 1,200 cars, 33 tracks, the inclusion of Brands Hatch and the Gooper Festival of Speed Hill Climb to name just a few new faces, and the ability to use multiple displays for more immersive driving, provided you had multiple PS3s and enough copies of the game to power this novelty, Gran Turismo 6 was pretty feature-rich. However, since the title released after the PlayStation 4 in most markets, it didn't get the same attention as its predecessor. There were no DLCs for the game, just a few free cars now and then. Microtransactions were pretty prominent in the game, as to be expected from something AAA releasing in the 2010s, and while the reception was still overall good, sales were less than half of that of Gran Turismo 5. Players were waiting for the next big thing, the title to really show what the powerhouse PlayStation 4 was truly capable of, but they'd have to wait a while. The PlayStation 4 utterly annihilated the Xbox One in terms of sales figures across their lifespans. Spectacular first-party titles, solid game performance across the board, and mid-generation additions such as the PS4 Pro and PSVR, a PS4 in any respect wasn't a bad purchase. It took 4 years for Polyphony to release their staple on this insanely successful system. Come Paris Games Week in 2015, Gran Turismo Sport was announced. The lack of a numeric suffix led to an uncertainty as to how this game would be different. Sony presented the title as a sidestep for the series, but conversely, Yamauchi stated it was a mainline game, just without a number this time. Released in late 2017, Sport in some regards did exactly what you'd expect of a next-generation Gran Turismo title. Improved the graphics and physics tenfold, added new cars and features such as Porsche vehicles for the first time, and support for the PSVR, and finally, a livery editor. What set Sport apart, why it was titled as such, was that Polyphony pushed this new title to be the Gran Turismo focused on online racing. By the late 2010s, multiplayer-only video game releases were becoming more popular, but were occasionally criticised for pushing away a demographic that didn't play online games, or even pay for PlayStation Plus to play things online in the first place. While single-player content was somewhat present upon release, it wasn't the focus, and the initial reception wasn't entirely glowing. It wasn't a dumpster fire of a title by any means, but it didn't feel like the Gran Turismo players wanted for their sparkly new, okay, 4-year-old PlayStation 4s. A career mode akin to those seen in games past was added later that same year, giving the single-player crowd a bit more to sink their teeth into, but online play remained the major focus. The FIA backed the game's competitive online scene, and as recent as this year, Gran Turismo Sport was used in the Virtual Olympics. GT Sport left reviewers a little stumped. The driving was the best it had ever been in a Gran Turismo title, and the online racing was solid as anything, though the sheer decrease in available cars and tracks, and the aforementioned lack of single-player content upon release led to a somewhat rocky start for the game. If you were a PS4 owner come 2017 and beyond, you'd have noticed how quickly the price dropped for the game. I picked it up for less than 20 quid, and that was during its first year of release. Since those early reviews praising the mechanics but criticising the overall content stuck, the image of Gran Turismo Sport wasn't all that good. But as someone who's recently got back into playing it, it's probably the best 14 odd quid you'd ever spend on your PS4. Sport was the only title in the Gran Turismo series that was planned to release on the PS4, so now, 4 years after release, where do we look for what comes next from Polyphony? During the year that never was, we were treated to the reveal and subsequent struggle that was the PlayStation 5. A polarising system in terms of its looks and who actually managed to buy one, but its power was simply unprecedented. Also revealed was Polyphony's next project, Gran Turismo 7, the numbered sequel we were all waiting for. Games released for the PS5 are stunning already, so imagine just how good a Gran Turismo title would look at 4K with ray tracing on, etc. The best parts of games past, the single-player campaign and vastness of the garage, and the best parts of games present, the online racing and new simulation mechanics, were coming together to create the best console racing sim ever produced. We hope. Gran Turismo's critical legacy declined over the course of its life. Nothing overly drastic, but some might say the series slipped slightly from its roots. Gran Turismo 7 looks to bring itself back to the top. Even the return of Trial Mountain in the reveal trailer looked to be a good sign. Originally slated for a 2021 PS5 release, Polyphony pushed the game back to 2022, citing the pandemic as the reason why, and supposedly also releasing on PS4 as well. As the legend himself Shigeru Miyamoto once said, "A delayed game is eventually good, but a rushed game is forever bad." The future looks bright for Gran Turismo, but it's not like the past was ever dim. It had its moments, sure, but Kazunori Yamauchi and his team have worked miracles with Sony's hardware over the course of the last 2 and a bit decades. Millions of miles of track have been traversed, millions of copies of the franchise are sold, and millions of goosebumps have risen when players hear that nostalgic countdown sound effect for the millionth time. So that's our look back at Gran Turismo. Which title was your favourite? Let me know in the comment section below. Like and share the video if you enjoyed it, and please do subscribe to the Traxion channel if you haven't already, and ring the bell for notifications. Thank you very much for watching, keep it pinned, and I'll see you next time.